Hello and welcome to the Cultured Bumpkin, you cultured bumpkins. This is another episode, if you will, a live recording session for Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Tonight we're starting with chapter 35. There's only 50 total. We got 15 more to go, and then we'll be ready to post it as an audiobook after it gets edited. So, if you're new here, thank you for joining us. And what I do is I record it, and then afterwards I take the audio and then put it into audiobook form. And then at the end of all the sessions, I post it as a 12-hour, 6-hour, 8-hour, whatever audiobook. We've done Pride and Prejudice. That's about 12 hours. Persuasion is close to, I think, 9 hours. And we're doing Sense and Sensibility, and we've done a lot of other ones. A Christmas Carol, Anne of Green Gables. Anyway, so if you have a favorite book, definitely let me know in the comments what you'd like, and that's how I pick my next book, is what other people have sort of suggested. So, without further ado, let's get to reading. Well, after we turn this thing off. All right, thank you very much. Good deal. And actually, I need to hook this up right quick. Sorry. It's like a circus in here tonight. Stuff going off. I got stuff that's got to be. Thank you for being patient. All right, here we go. Here we go. Chapter 35. Elinor's curiosity to see Mrs. Ferrars was satisfied. She had found in her everything that could tend to make a further connection between the families undesirable. She had seen enough of her pride, her meanness, and her determined prejudice against herself to comprehend all the difficulties that must have perplexed the engagement and retarded the marriage of Edward and herself, had he been otherwise free. And she had seen almost enough to be thankful for her own sake that one greater obstacle preserved her from suffering under any other of Mrs. Ferras's creation. That one greater obstacle preserved her from suffering under any other of Mrs. Ferras's creation, preserved her from an all dependence upon her caprice or any solicitude of her good opinion. Or at least, if she did not bring herself quite to rejoice in Edward's being fettered to Lucy, she determined that had Lucy been more amiable, she ought to have rejoiced. She wondered what Lucy's spirits could be so very much elevated by the civility of Mrs. Ferrars, that her interest and her vanity should be so very much blind her as to make the attention which seemed only paid her because she was not Elinor appear a compliment to herself, or to allow her to derive encouragement from a preference only given to her because her real situation was unknown. But that it was so had not only been declared by Lucy's eyes at the time, but she was declared over again the next morning more openly, for at her particular desire, Lady Middleton set her down in Berkeley Street on the chance of seeing Elinor alone to tell her how happy she was. The chance proved a lucky one, for a message from Mrs. Palmer soon after she arrived carried Mrs. Jennings away. "My dear friend," cried Lucy as soon as they were by themselves. Quit doing this. Somebody keeps texting me. Stop it. Right. I thought it was on silent, but apparently it wasn't. Hello to anybody that's watching live or catching the replay. Hope you're having a great evening or wherever it is that you're at. And this Coke Zero, which is absolutely terrible for you, but, I got to keep the old whistle wet somehow. "My dear friend," cried Lucy as soon as they were by themselves, "I come to talk to you of my happiness. Could anything be so flattering as Mrs. Ferris's way of treating me yesterday? So exceeding affable as she was. And you know how I dreaded the thoughts of seeing her. But the very moment I was introduced, there was such an affability in her behavior as really should seem to say she had quite took a fancy to me. Now was it not so? You saw it all, and was not you quite and was not you quite struck with it? She was certainly very civil to you. Civil? Did you see nothing but only civility? I saw a vast deal more. Such kindness as fell to the share of nobody but me. No pride, no halter, and your sister just the same, all sweetness and affability. Elinor wished to talk of something else, but Lucy still pressed her to own that she had reason for her happiness, and Elinor was obliged to go on. Undoubtedly, if they had known of your engagement, said she, nothing could be more flattering than their treatment of you. But as that was not the case, I guessed you would say so, replied Lucy quickly. But there was no reason in the world why Mrs. Ferris should seem to like me if she did not, and her liking me is everything. You shan't talk me out of my satisfaction. I'm sure it will all end well, and there will be no difficulties at all to what I used to think. Mrs. Ferris is a charming woman, and so is your sister. They're both delightful women indeed. I wonder I should never hear you say how agreeable Mrs. Dashwood was. To this Elinor had no answer to make, and did not attempt any. Are you ill, Miss Dashwood? You seem low. You don't speak. Sure you ain't well. I never was in better health. Well, I'm glad of it with all my heart, but really you do not look it. I'm sorry to I should be sorry to have you ill, and that have been the greatest comfort to me in the world. Heaven knows what I should have done without your friendship. Elinor tried to make a civil answer, though doubting her own success, but it seemed to satisfy Lucy, for she directly replied, Indeed, I'm perfectly convinced of your regard for me, and next to Edward's love, it's the greatest comfort I could have. Poor Edward, but now there's one thing we shall be able to meet, and meet pretty often, for Lady Middleton's delighted with Mrs. Dashwood's. But now there's one good thing. We shall be able to meet and meet pretty often, for Lady Middleton's delighted with Mrs. Dashwood, so we shall be a good deal in Harley Street, I dare say, and Edward spends half his time with his sister. Besides, Lady Middleton and Mrs. Ferris will visit now, and Mrs. Ferris and your sister were both so good to stay and Mrs. Ferris and your sister were both so good to say more than once that they should always be glad to see me. They're such charming women. I'm sure if you ever tell your sister what I think of her, you can't speak too high. But Elinor would not give her any encouragement to hope that she should tell her sister. Lucy continued, I'm sure that I should have seen it in a moment if Mrs. Ferris had took a dislike to me. If she had only made me a formal curtsy, for instance, without saying a word, and never after had and never after took any notice of me, and never looked at me in a pleasant way. You know what I mean. If I'd been treated in that forbidden sort of way, I should have gave it all up in despair. I could not have stood it. For where does she dislike? I know it. For where does she dislike? I know it's most violent. Elinor was prevented from making any reply to the civil triumph by the doors being thrown open, the servants announcing Mr. Ferris, and Edward's immediately walking in. It was a very awkward moment, and the countenance of each showed that it was so. They all looked exceedingly foolish, and Edward seemed to have as great an inclination to walk out of the room again as to advance farther into it. The very circumstance, in its unpleasantest form, which they would each have been most anxious to avoid, had fallen on them. They were not only all three together, but were together without the relief of any other person. The ladies recovered themselves first. It was not Lucy's business to put herself forward, and the appearance of secrecy must still be kept up. She could therefore only look her tenderness, and after slightly addressing him, said no more. But Elinor had more to do, and so anxious was she, for his sake and her own, to do it well, that she forced herself, after a moment's recollection, to welcome him with a look and manner that were almost easy and almost open. And another struggle, after another effort still improved him. Let's let's see. Hey, Kristen, what's going on? Let's see. Okay. But Elinor had more to do, and so anxious was she, for his sake and her own, to do it well, that she forced herself, after a moment's recollection, to welcome him with a look and manner that were almost easy and almost open. At another struggle, another effort still improved him. She would not allow the presence of Lucy, nor the conscientiousness of some injustice towards herself, to deter her from saying that she was happy to see him, and that she had very much regretted being from home when he called before in Berkeley Street. She would not be frightened from paying him those attentions which, as a friend and almost a relation, were his due by the observant eyes of Lucy, though she soon perceived him to be narrowly watching her. Her manners gave some reassurance to Edward, and he had courage enough to sit down, but his embarrassment still exceeded that of the ladies in a proportion which the case rendered reasonable, though his sex might make it rare, for his heart had not the indifference of Lucy's, nor could his conscience have quite the ease of Elinor's. Lucy, with a demure and settled air, seemed determined to make no contribution to the comfort of the others, and would not say a word. And almost everything that was said proceeded from Elinor, who was obliged to volunteer all the information about her mother's health, their coming to town, etc., which Edward ought to have inquired about, but never did. Her exertions did not stop there, for she soon afterwards felt herself so heroically disposed as to determine, under pretense of fetching Marianne, to leave the others by themselves, and she really did it, and that in the handsomest manner, for she loitered away several minutes on the landing place with the most high-minded fortitude before she went to her sister. When that was once done, however, it was time for the raptures of Edward to cease, for Marianne's joy hurried her into the drawing-room immediately. Her pleasure in seeing him was like every other of her feelings, strong in itself and strongly spoken. She met him with a hand that would be taken and a voice that expressed the affection of a sister. Excuse me. "Dear Edward," she cried, "this is a moment of great happiness. This would almost make amends for everything." Edward tried to return her kindness as it deserved, but before such witnesses he declared not half what he really felt. Again they all sat down, and for a moment or two all were silent, while Marianne was looking with the most speaking tenderness, sometimes at Edward and sometimes at Elinor, regretting only that their delight in each other should be checked by Lucy's unwelcome presence. Edward was the first to speak, and it was to notice Marianne's altered looks and express his fear of her not finding London agree with her. "Oh, don't think of me," she replied with spirited earnestness, though her eyes were filled with tears as she spoke. "Don't think of my health. Elinor's well, you see. That must be enough for both of us." This remark was not calculated to make Edward or Elinor more easy, nor to conciliate the goodwill of Lucy, who looked up at Marianne with no very benign expression. "Do you like London?" asked Edward, willing to say anything that might introduce another subject. "Not at all. I expected much pleasure in it, but I've found none. The sight of you, Edward, is the only comfort it has afforded, and thank heaven, you are what you always were." She paused. No one spoke. "I think, Elinor," she presently added, "we must employ Edward to take care of us in our return to Barton. In a week or two, I suppose we shall be going, and I trust Edward will not be very unwilling to accept the charge." Poor Edward muttered something, but what it was nobody knew, not even himself. But Marianne, who saw his agitation and could easily trace it to whatever cause best pleased her, was perfectly satisfied and soon talked of something else. "We spent such a day, Edward, in Harley Street yesterday. So dull, so wretchedly dull. But I have much to say to you on that head, which cannot be said now." And with this admirable discretion did she defer the assurance of her finding their mutual relatives more disagreeable than ever, and of her being particularly disgusted with his mother till they were more in private. "But why were you not there, Edward? Why didn't you come?" "I was engaged elsewhere." "Engaged? And what was that, when such friends were to be met?" Perhaps, Miss Marianne, cried Lucy, eager to take some revenge on her, you think young men never stand upon engagements, if they have no mind to keep 'em, little as well as great. Elinor was very angry, but Marianne seemed entirely insensible of the sting, for she calmly replied, not so indeed, for seriously speaking, I'm very sure that conscience only kept Edward from Harley Street, and I really believe that he has the most delicate conscience in the world, the most scrupulous in performing every engagement, however minute, and however it may make against his interest or pleasures. He's the most fearful of giving pain, of wounding expectation, and the most incapable of being selfish of anybody I ever saw. Edward, it is so, and I will say it. What, are you never to hear yourself praised? Then you must be no friend of mine, for those who will accept of my love and esteem must submit to my open commendation. The nature of her commendation, in the present case, however, happened to be particularly ill-suited to the feelings of 2/3 of her auditors, and so was very unexhilarating to Edward that he very soon got up to go away. Going so soon? Said Marianne. My dear Edward, this must not be. And drawing him a little aside, she whispered her persuasion that Lucy could not stay much longer. But even this encouragement failed, for he would go, and Lucy, who would have outstayed him had his visit lasted 2 hours, soon afterwards went away. What can bring her here so often? Said Marianne on her leaving him. Could not she see that we wanted her gone? How teasing to Edward! Why so? We're all his friends, and Lucy's been the longest known to him of any. It is but natural that he should like to see her as well as ourselves. Marianne looked at her steadily and said, You know, Elinor, that this is a kind of talking which I cannot bear. If you only hope to have your assertion contradicted, as I must suppose to be the case, you ought to recollect that I'm the last person in the world to do it. I cannot descend to be tricked out of assurances that are not really wanted. She then left the room, and Elinor dared not follow her to say any more, for bound as she was by her promise of secrecy to Lucy, she could give no information that would convince Marianne, and painful as the consequences of her still continuing in error might be, she was obliged to submit to it. All that she could hope was that Edward would not often expose her or himself to the distress of hearing Marianne's mistaken warmth, nor to the repetition of any other part of the pain that had attended their recent meeting. And this she had every reason to expect. That's the end of chapter 35. Hope you're doing well. If you're live or catching the replay, welcome. Welcome, welcome. Getting into 36. And also, if you have any suggestions for the next ones, we got 14 chapters left. Probably be done sometime next week. Early next week, maybe. And then we're starting another one, hopefully. So, if you have any votes for something that is public domain, so pre-19, or pre-1925, let me know in the comments or somewhere on the page, comment on something and let me know. Northanger Abbey, Wuthering Heights, A Tale of Two Cities, North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. Several have been suggested and I like them, but we'll see. Or might do some short stories or something for a little bit, because I will be in Chicago recording an audio drama in early part of March. So, I won't be doing lives in here in my studio for about a week. So, I'll do lives, but just not in here. Okay. Chapter 36. Within a few days after this meeting, the newspapers announced to the world that the lady of Thomas Palmer, Esquire, was safely delivered of a son and heir. A very interesting and satisfactory paragraph, at least to all those intimate, excuse me, at least to all those intimate connections who knew it before. This event, highly important to Mrs. Jennings' happiness, produced a temporary alteration in the disposal of her time and influenced, in a like degree, the engagements of her young friends. For as she wished to be as much as possible with Charlotte, she went thither every morning as soon as she was dressed and did not return till late in the evening. And the Miss Dashwoods, at the particular request of the Middletons, spent the whole of every day in Conduit Street. For their own comfort, they would much rather have remained at least all for their own comfort, they would much rather have remained at least all the morning in Mrs. Jennings' house. But it was not a thing to be urged against the wishes of everybody. Their hours were therefore made over to Lady Middleton and the two Miss Steeles, by whom their company, in fact, was as little valued as it was professedly sought. By whom their company, in fact, was as little valued as it was professedly sought. They had too much sense to be desirable companions to the former, and by the latter they were considered with a jealous eye as intruding on their ground and sharing the kindness which they wanted to monopolize. Though nothing could be more polite than Lady Middleton's behavior to Elinor and Marianne, she did not really like them at all, because they neither flattered herself nor her children. She could not believe them good-natured, and because they flattered neither herself nor her children, she could not believe them good-natured, and because they were fond of reading, she fancied them satirical, perhaps without exactly knowing what it was to be satirical, but that did not signify. It was censure in common use and easily given. Their presence was a restraint both on her and on Lucy. It checked the idleness of one and the business of the other. Lady Middleton was ashamed of doing nothing before him, and the flattery which Lucy was proud to think of and administer at other times, she feared they would despise her for offering. Miss Steele was the least discomposed of the three by their presence, and it was in their power to reconcile her to it entirely. Would either of them have only given her a full and minute account of the whole affair between Marianne and Mr. Willoughby, she would have thought herself amply rewarded for the sacrifice of the best place by the fire after dinner which their arrival occasioned. But this conciliation was not granted, for though she often threw out expressions of pity for her sister to Elinor, and more than once dropped a reflection on the inconstancy of Beau before Marianne, no effect was produced, but a look of indifference from the former or of disgust from the latter. An effort even yet lighter might have made her their friend, would they only have laughed at her about the doctor. But so little were they, any more than the others, inclined to oblige her, that if Sir John dined from home, she might spend a whole day without hearing any other raillery on the subject than what she was kind enough to bestow on herself. All these jealousies and discontents, however, were so totally unsuspected by Mrs. Jennings that she thought it a delightful thing for the girls to be together, and generally congratulated her young friends every night on having escaped the company of a stupid old woman so long. She joined them sometimes at Sir John's, sometimes at her own house, and sometimes she always came in excellent spirit. But whenever it was, she always came in excellent spirits, full of delight and importance, attributing Charlotte's well-doing to her own care, and ready to give so exact, so minute a detail of her situation as only Miss Steele had curiosity enough to desire. One thing did disturb her, and of that made her daily complaint. Mr. Palmer maintained the common but unfatherly opinion among his sex of all infants being alike, and though she could plainly perceive at different times the most striking resemblance between this baby and every one of his relations on both sides, there was no convincing his father of it, no persuading him to believe that it was not exactly like every other baby of the same age, nor could he even be brought to acknowledge the simple proposition of its being the finest child in the world. I come now to the relation of a misfortune, which about this time befell Mrs. John Dashwood. It so happened that while her two sisters with Mrs. Jennings were first calling on her in Harley Street, Another of her acquaintance had dropped in, a circumstance in itself not apparently likely to produce evil to her. But while the imaginations of other people will carry him away to form wrong judgments on our conduct and to decide on it by slight appearances, one's happiness must in some measure be always at the mercy of chance. In the present instance, this last arrived lady allowed her fancy to so far outrun truth and probability that on merely hearing the name of the Miss Dashwoods and understanding them to be Mr. Dashwood's sisters, she immediately concluded them to be staying in Harley Street, and this misconstruction produced within a day or two afterwards cards of invitation for them as well as for their brother and sister to a small musical party at her house, the consequence of which was that Mrs. John Dashwood was obliged to submit not only to the exceedingly great inconvenience of sending her carriage for the Miss Dashwoods, but, what was still worse, must be subject to all the unpleasantness of appearing to treat them with attention, and who could tell that they might not and who could tell that excuse me, and who could tell that they might not expect to go out with her a second time. The power of disappointing them, it was true, must always be hers. But that was not enough, for when people are determined on a mode of conduct which they know is wrong, they feel injured by the expectation of anything better from them. Marianne had now been brought by degrees so much into the habit of going out every day that it had become a matter of indifference to her whether she went or not, and she prepared quietly and mechanically for every evening's engagement, though without expecting the smallest amusement from any, and very often without knowing till the last moment where it was to take her. To her dress and appearance she was grown so perfectly indifferent as to not bestow half the consideration on it during the whole of her toilet, which it received from Miss Steele in the first 5 minutes of their being together when it was finished. Nothing escaped her minute observation and general curiosity. She saw everything and asked everything, was never easy till she knew the price of every part of Marianne's dress, and could have guessed the number of her gowns together with better judgment than Marianne herself, and was not without hopes of finding out before they parted how much her washing cost per week, and how much she had spent every year, and how much she had every year to spend upon herself. The impertinence of these kind of scrutinies, moreover, was generally concluded with a compliment, which though meant which was generally concluded with a compliment, which was considered by Marianne as the greatest impertinence of all. For after undergoing an examination into the value and make of her gown, the color of her shoes, and the arrangement of her hair, she was almost sure of being told that, upon her word, she looked vastly smart, and she dared say she would make a great many conquests. With such encouragement as this, she was dismissed on the present occasion to her brother's carriage, which they were ready to enter 5 minutes after it stopped at the door, a punctuality not very agreeable to her sister-in-law, who had preceded them to the house of her acquaintance, and was there hoping for some delay on their part that might inconvenience either herself or her coachman. The events of this evening were not very remarkable. The party, like other musical parties, comprehended a great many people who had real taste for the performance, and a great many more who had none at all, and the performers themselves were, as usual, in their own estimation and that of their immediate friends, the first private performers in England. As Elinor was neither musical nor affecting to be so, she made no scruple of turning her eyes from the grand pianoforte whenever it suited her, and unrestrained even by the presence of a harp and violoncello, would fix them at pleasure on any other object in the room. In one of these excursive glances, she perceived among a group of young men the very he who had given them a lecture on toothpick cases at Gray's. She perceived him soon afterwards looking at herself and speaking familiarly to her brother, and had just determined to find out his name from the latter when they both came towards her, and Mr. Dashwood introduced him to her as Mr. Robert Ferrars. He addressed He addressed her with easy civility and twisted his head into a bow which assured her, as plainly as words could have done, that he was exactly the coxcomb she had heard him described to be by Lucy. Happy had it been for her if her regard for Edward had depended less on his own merit than on the merit of his nearest relations. For then his brother's bow must have given the finishing stroke of what the ill humor of his mother and sister would have begun. But while she wondered at the difference of the two young men, she did not find that the emptiness of conceit of the one put her all out of charity with the modesty and worth of the other. Why they were different, Robert exclaimed to her himself in the course of a quarter of an hour's conversation, for talking of his brother and lamenting the extreme gaucherie which he really believed kept him from mixing in proper society. He candidly and generously attributed it much less to any natural deficiency than to the misfortune of a private education, while he himself, though probably without any material superiority by nature, merely from the advantage of a public school, was as well fitted to mix in the world as any other man. Upon my soul, he added, I believe it's nothing more, and so often I shall tell my mother when she's grieving about it. My dear madam, I always say to her, you must make yourself easy. The evil is now irremediable, and it's been entirely your own doing. Why would you be persuaded by my uncle, Sir Robert, against your judgment, to place Edward under private tuition at the most critical time of his life? If you had only sent him to Westminster, as well as myself, instead of sending him to Mr. Pratt's, all this would have been prevented. This is the way in which I consider the matter. And my mother's perfectly convinced of her error. Elinor would not oppose his opinion because, whatever might be her general estimation of the advantage of a public school, she could not think of Edward's abode in Mr. Pratt's family with any satisfaction. You reside in Devonshire, I think, was his next observation, in a cottage near Dawlish. Elinor set him right as to its situation, and it seemed rather surprising to him that anybody could live in Devonshire without living near Dawlish. He bestowed his hearty approbation, however, on their species of house. For my own part, said he, I'm excessively fond of a cottage. There's always so much comfort, so much elegance about them, and I protest if I had any money to spare, I should buy a little land and build one myself within a short distance of London, where I might drive myself down at any time and collect a few friends about me and be happy. I advise everybody who's going to build a cottage. My friend Lord Courtland came to me the other day on purpose to ask my advice and laid before me 3 different plans of Bonomies. I was to decide on the best of them. My dear Courtland, said I, immediately throwing them all into the fire, do not adopt either of them, but by all means build a cottage. And that, I fancy, will be the end of it. Excuse me. A little break. Jane Eyre is a great book. The thing I don't like about Jane Eyre is it's written in the first person from a female perspective, and I just think that's weird to have a old guy. It just sounds weird to the listener, I would think. I mean, I don't know, but like this, even though it's the same sort of subject matter, it's from a third person narrative. You see what I'm saying? So I don't know. I've thought about that one, but when I started reading it, I was like, I don't know if this would be well received or not. It might be distracting. So whereas like Wuthering Heights, which is Gothic type of thing, it's from the point of view of Mr. Lockwood, who's some dude. So anyway, we'll see. Another thing that I want to do is get like on this channel is to get other voice actors that like the classics, and then like have maybe Jane Eyre get a female voice actor to do that. I think that would be really cool. But we'll see. All right. Robert is still bloviating. Some people imagine that there can be no accommodations, no space in a cottage, but that's all a mistake. I was last month at my friend Elliot's near Dartford. Lady Elliot wished to give a dance. But how can it be done? Said she. My dear Ferrars, do tell me how it's to be managed. There's not a room in this cottage that'll hold 10 couple, and where can the supper be? I immediately saw that there could be no difficulty in it, so I said, My dear Lady Elliot, do not be uneasy. The dining parlor will admit 18 couples with ease. Card tables might be placed in the drawing room. The library may be open for tea and other refreshments, and let the supper be set out in a saloon. Lady Elliot was delighted with the thought. We measured the dining room and found it would hold exactly 18 couples, and the affair was arranged precisely after my plan. So that, in fact, you see, if people do not but know how to set it, if people do not know how, if people do but not, if people do but know how to set it, every comfort may be as well enjoyed in a cottage as in the most spacious dwelling. Elinor agreed to it all, for she could not think he deserved the compliment of rational opposition. As John Dashwood had no more pleasure in music than his eldest sister, his mind was equally at liberty to fix on anything else, and a thought struck him during the evening, which he communicated to his wife for her approbation when they got home. The consideration of Mrs. Dennison's mistake in supposing his sisters their guest had suggested the propriety of their being really invited to become such, while Mrs. Jennings' engagements kept her from home. The expense could be nothing. The expense could be nothing, the inconvenience not more, and it was altogether an attention which the delicacy of his conscience pointed out to be requisite to its complete enfranchisement from his promise to his father. Fanny was startled at the proposal. I do not see how it can be done, she said. Without affronting Lady Middleton, they spend every day with her. Otherwise, I should be exceedingly glad to do it. You know I'm always ready to pay 'em any attention in my power, as my taking 'em out this evening shows, but they are Lady Middleton's visitors. How can I ask them away from her? Her husband, but with great humility, did not see the force of her objection. They had already spent a week in this manner in Conduit Street, and Lady Middleton could not be displeased at their giving the same number of days to such near relations. Fanny paused a moment, and then with fresh vigor said, My love, I would ask them with all my heart if it was in my power, but I had just settled then myself to ask the Miss Steeles to spend a few days with us. They're very well behaved, good kind of girls, and I think the attention is due 'em, as their uncle did so very well by Edward. We can ask your sisters some other year, you know, but the Miss Steeles may not be in town any more. I'm sure you'll like 'em. Indeed, you do like 'em, you know, very much already, and so does my mother, and they're such favorites with Harry. Mr. Dashwood was convinced. He saw the necessity of inviting the Miss Steeles immediately, and his conscience was pacified by the resolution of inviting his sisters another year at the same time. However, slyly suspecting that another year would make the invitation needless by bringing Elinor to town as Colonel Brandon's wife and Marianne as their visitor. Fanny, rejoicing in their escape and proud of the ready wit that had procured it, wrote the next morning to Lucy to request her company and her sisters for some days in Harley Street as soon as Lady Middleton could spare 'em. This was enough to make Lucy really and reasonably happy. Mrs. Dashwood seemed actually working for her herself, cherishing all her hopes and promoting all her views. Such an opportunity of being with Edward and his family was above all things the most material to her interest, and such an invitation the most gratifying to her feelings. It was an advantage that could not be too gratefully acknowledged, nor too speedily made use of, and the visit to Lady Middleton, which had not before had any precise limits, was instantly discovered to have been always meant to end in 2 days' time. When the note was shown to Elinor, as it was within 10 minutes after its arrival, it gave her, for the first time, some share in the expectations of Lucy. For such a mark of uncommon kindness, vouchsafed on so short an acquaintance, seemed to declare that the goodwill towards her arose from something more than merely malice against her, and might be brought, by time and address, to do everything that Lucy wished. Her flattery had already subdued the pride of Lady Middleton, and had an entry into the close heart of Mr. John, and made an entry into the close heart of Mrs. John Dashwood, and these were effects that laid open the probability of greater. The Miss Steeles removed to Harley Street, and all that reached Elinor of their influence there strengthened her expectation of the event. Sir John, who called on them more than once, brought home such accounts of the favor they were in as must be universally striking. Mrs. Dashwood had never been so much pleased with any young women in her life as she was with them, had given each of them a needle book made by some immigrant, called Lucy by her Christian name, and didn't know whether she'd ever be able to part with them. That's the end of chapter 36. I'll do another one. Try to. It's kind of a long one. Let's see. Chapter 37. Mrs. Palmer was so well at the end of a fortnight that her mother felt it no longer necessary to give up the whole of her time to her, and contenting herself with visiting with her once or twice a day, returned from that period to her own home and her own habits, in which she found the Miss Dashwoods very ready to reassume their former share. Man, that was a loud stomach growl. In which she found the Miss Dashwoods very ready to resume their former share. About the third or fourth morning after their being thus resettled in Berkeley Street, Mrs. Jennings, on returning from her ordinary visit to Mrs. Palmer, entered the drawing-room where Elinor was sitting by herself, with such an air of such hurry and importance as prepared her to hear something wonderful, and given her time only to form that idea, began directly to justify it by saying, excuse me, "Lord, my dear Miss Dashwood, have you heard the news?" "No, ma'am, what is it?" "Something so strange, but you shall hear of it. When I got to Mr. Palmer's, I found Charlotte quite in a fuss about the child. She was sure it was very ill. It cried and fretted and was all over pimples." Excuse me. "So I looked at it directly, and Lord, my dear, says I, it's nothing in the world but red gum." And the nurse said just the same thing. But Charlotte would not be satisfied, so Mr. Donovan was sent for, and luckily he happened to come in from Harley Street, so he stepped over directly, and as soon as he saw the child, he said just what we did, that it was nothing in the world but the red gum. Then Charlotte was easy. And so just as she was going away again, it came into my head. I'm sure I do not know how I happened to think of it, but it came into my head to ask him if there was any news. So upon that he smirked and simpered and looked grave and seemed to know something or other, and at last he said in a whisper, for fear any unpleasant report should reach the young ladies under your care as to their sister's indisposition, I think it advisable to say that I believe there's no great reason for alarm. I hope Mrs. Dashwood will do very well." "What, is Fanny ill?" "That is exactly what I said, my dear. Lord, says I, is Mrs. Dashwood ill?" So then it all came out, and the long and the short of the matter, by all I can learn, seems to be this. Mr. Edward Ferrars, the very young man I used to joke with you about, but however, as it turns out, I'm monstrous glad there was never anything in it. Mr. Edward Ferrars, it seems, has been engaged above this 12-month to my cousin, Lucy. There's for you, my dear, and not a creature knowing a syllable of the matter except Nancy. Could you believe such a thing possible? There's no great wonder in their liking one another, but that matters should be brought so forward between them. There's no great wonder in their liking one another, but that matters should be brought so forward between them, and nobody suspect it. That's strange. I never happened to see them together. or I'm sure I would have found it out directly. Well, and so this was kept at a great secret for fear of Mrs. Ferrars, and neither she nor your brother or sister suspected a word of the matter till this very morning. Poor Nancy, who, is a well-meaning creature, but no conjurer, popped it all out. Lord, thinks she said to herself, they're all so fond of Lucy. To be sure they'll make no difficulty about it. And so away she went to your sister, who was sitting all alone at her carpet work, little suspecting what was to come, for she had just been saying to your brother only 5 minutes before that she thought to make a match between Edward and some lord's daughter or other, I forget who. So you may think what a blow it was to all her vanity and pride. She fell into violent hysterics immediately, with such screams as reached your brother's ears as he was sitting in his own dressing room downstairs thinking about writing a letter to his steward in the country. So up he flew directly. A terrible scene took place, for Lucy was to come by him at that time, little dreaming for Lucy was come to him by that time, little dreaming of what was going on. Poor soul, I pity her, and I must say I think she was used very hardly, for your sister scolded like any fury, and soon drove her into a fainting fit. Nancy, she fell on her knees and cried bitterly, and your brother, he walked about the room and said he did not know what to do. Mrs. Dashwood declared that she should not stay a minute longer in the house, and your brother was forced to go out upon his knees, too, to persuade her to stay till they had packed up their clothes. To persuade her to let them stay till they had packed up their clothes. Then she fell into hysterics again, and was so frightened that he would send for Dr. Donovan, and Dr. Donovan found the house in all this uproar. The carriage was at the door ready to take my poor cousins away, and they were just stepping in as he came off. Poor Lucy in such a condition, he says, she could hardly walk. And Nancy, well, she was almost as bad. I declare I have no patience with your sister, and I hope with all my heart it will be a match in spite of her. Lord, what a taken poor Mr. Edwards will be. What a taken poor Mr. Edwards will be in when he hears of it, to have his love used so scornfully. For they say he's monstrous fond of her, as well as he may. I should not wonder if he were not the greatest in compassion. I should not wonder if he was to be in the greatest passion. And Mr. Donovan thinks just the same. He and I had a great deal of talk about it. And best of all is he's gone back again to Harley Street, that he may be within call when Mrs. Ferrars is told of it. For she was sent for as soon as ever my cousins left the house, for your sister was sure she would be in hysterics too, and so she may, for what I care. I have no pity for either of them. I have no notion of people's making such a to-do about money and greatness. There's no reason on earth why Mr. Edward and Lucy should not marry, for I'm sure Mrs. Ferrars may afford to do very well by her son, and though Lucy has next to nothing herself, she knows better than anybody how to make the most of everything. I dare say if Mrs. Ferrars would only allow him 500 a year, she would make as good an appearance with it as anybody else would with 8. Lord, how snug they might live in such a little cottage as yours, or a little bigger, with 2 maids and 2 men, and I believe I could help them with a house. And I believe I could help him find a housemaid, for my Betty has a sister out of place, and I'd fit him exactly. Here Mrs. Jennings ceased, and as Elinor had time enough to collect her thoughts, she was able to give such an answer and make such observations as the subject might naturally be supposed to produce. Happy to find that she was not suspected of any extraordinary interest in it, that Mrs. Jennings, as she had of late hoped might be the case, had ceased to imagine her at all attached to Edward, and happy above all the rest in the absence of Marianne, she felt very able to speak of the affair without embarrassment, and to give her judgment, as she believed, with impartiality on the conduct of everyone concerned in it. She could hardly determine what her own expectation of its event really was, though she earnestly tried to drive away the notion of its being possible to end otherwise at last than in the marriage of Edward and Lucy. What Mrs. Ferrars would say and do, though there could not be a doubt of its nature, she was anxious to hear, and still more anxious to know how Edward would conduct himself. For him, she felt much compassion. For Lucy, very little, and it cost her some pains to procure that little. For the rest of the party, none at all. As Mrs. Jennings would talk on no other subject, Elinor soon saw the necessity of preparing Marianne for its discussion. No time was to be lost in undeceiving her, making her acquainted with the real truth, and in endeavoring to bring her to hear it talked of by others, without betraying that she felt any uneasiness for her sister or any resentment against Edward. Elinor's office was a painful one. She was going to remove what she really believed to be her sister's chief consolation. To give particulars of Edward, she feared to give such particulars of Edward as she feared would ruin him forever in her good opinion, and to make Marianne, by a resemblance in their situations, which to her fancy would seem strong, feel all her own disappointment over again. But unwelcome as such a task may be, it was necessary to be done, and Elinor therefore hastened to perform it. She was very far from wishing to dwell on her own feelings, or to represent herself as suffering much, any otherwise than the self-command she had practiced since her first knowledge of Edward's engagement. Any otherwise than as the self-command she had practiced since her first knowledge of Edward's engagement might suggest a hint of what was practicable to Marianne. Her narration was clear and simple, and though it could not be given without emotion, it was not accompanied by violent agitation nor impetuous grief. That belonged rather to the hearer, for Marianne listened with horror and cried excessively. Elinor was to be the comforter of others in her own distresses, no less than in theirs. Elinor was to be the comforter of others in her own distresses, no less than in theirs. And all the comfort that could be given by assurances of her own composure of mind, and a very earnest vindication of Edward from every charge but of imprudence, was readily offered. But Marianne, for some time, would give credit to neither. Edward seemed a second Willoughby, and acknowledging, as Elinor did, that she loved him most sincerely, could she feel less than her that she had loved him most sincerely, could she feel less than herself. As for Lucy Steele, she considered her so totally unamiable, so absolutely incapable of attaching a sensible man, that she could not be persuaded at first to believe, and afterwards to pardon, any former affection of Edward for her. She would not even admit it to have been natural, and Elinor left her to be convinced that it was so, by that which only could convince her a better knowledge of mankind. Her first communication had reached no farther than to state the fact of the engagement and the length of time it had existed. Marianne's feelings had then broken in and put an end to all regularity of detail, and for some time all that could be done was to soothe her distress, lessen her alarms, and combat her resentment. The first question on her side, which led to farther particulars, was, "How long has this been known to you, Elinor? Has he written to you?" "I have known it these 4 months. When Lucy first came to Barton Park last November, she told me in confidence of her engagement." At these words, Marianne's eyes expressed the astonishment which her lips could not utter. After a pause of wonder, she exclaimed, 4 months? Have you known of this for 4 months? Elinor confirmed it. What? While attending me in all my misery, has this been your heart, and I have reproached you for being happy? It was not fit that you should know then how much I was in the reverse. 4 months, cried Marianne again, so calm, so cheerful. Have you been supported? By feeling that I was doing my duty. My promise to Lucy obliged me to be secret. I owed it to her, therefore, to avoid giving any hint of the truth, and I owed it to my family and friends not to create in them a solicitude about me which could not be in my power to satisfy. Marianne seemed much struck. I have very often wished to undeceive I have very often wished to undeceive yourself and my mother, added Elinor, and once or twice I have attempted it, but without betraying my trust, I never could have convinced you. 4 months, and yet you loved him. Yes, but I did not only love him, and while the comfort of others was dear to me, I was glad to spare them from knowing how much I felt. Now I can think and speak of it with little emotion. I would not have you I would not have you suffer on my account, for I assure you I no longer suffer materially myself. I have many things to support me. I am not conscious of having provoked the disappointment by any imprudence of my own. I have borne it as much as possible without spreading it farther. I acquit Edward of essential misconduct. I wish him very happy, and am so sure of his always doing his duty that though now he may harbor some regret, in the end he must become so. Lucy does not want sense, and that's the foundation on which every good thing may be built. And after all, Marianne, after all that is bewitching in the idea of a single and constant attachment, and all that can be said of one's happiness dependent entirely on any particular person, it is not meant, it is not fit, it is not possible that it should be so. Edward will marry Lucy. He will marry a woman superior in person and understanding to half her sex, and time and habit will teach him to forget that he ever thought another superior to her. If such is your way of thinking, said Marianne, if the loss of what is most valued is so easily to be made up by something else, your resolution, your self-command are perhaps a little less to be wondered at. They are brought more within my comprehension. Well, I understand you. You do not suppose that I have ever felt much. For 4 months, Marianne, I have had all this hanging on my mind, without being at liberty to speak to a single creature, knowing that it would make you and my mother most unhappy whenever it were explained to you, yet unable to prepare you for it in the least. It was told me, it was in a manner forced on me by the very person herself, whose prior engagement ruined all my prospects, and told me, as I thought, with triumph. This person's suspicions, therefore, I have had to oppose by endeavoring to appear indifferent where I may have been most deeply interested. And it's not been only once. I have had her hopes and excuse me. I have had her hopes and exultation to listen to again and again. I have known myself to be divided from Edward forever without hearing one circumstance that could make me less desire the connection. Nothing has proved him unworthy, nor has anything declared him indifferent to me. I have had to contend against the unkindness of his sister and the insolence of his mother, and have suffered the punishment of an attachment without enjoying its advantages. And all this has been going on at a time when, as you know too well, it has not been my only unhappiness. If you can think me capable of ever feeling, surely you may suppose that I have suffered now. The composure of mind with which I have brought myself at present to consider the matter, the consolation that I've been willing to admit, have been the effect of constant and painful exertion. They did not spring up of themselves. They did not occur to relieve my spirits at first. No, Marianne, then, if I had not been bound to silence, perhaps nothing could have kept me entirely, not even what I owed to my dearest friends, from openly showing that I was very unhappy. Marianne was quite subdued. "Oh, Elinor," she cried, "you have made me hate myself forever. How barbarous I've been to you, you who have been my only comfort, who have borne with me in all my misery, who have seemed to be only suffering for me. Is this my gratitude? Is this the only return I can make you, because your merit cries out upon myself? I've been trying to do it away." The tenderest caresses followed this confession. In such a frame of mind as she was now in, Elinor had no difficulty in obtaining from her whatever promise she required, and at her request, Marianne engaged never to speak of any affair to anyone with the least appearance of bitterness, to meet Lucy without betraying the smallest increase of dislike to her, and even to see Edward himself, if chance should bring them together, without any diminution of her usual cordiality. These were great concessions, but where Marianne felt that she had injured, no reparation could be too much for her to make. She performed her promise of being discreet to admiration. She attended to all that Mrs. Jennings had to say upon the subject without an unchanging complexion, dissented from her in nothing, and was heard 3 times to say, "Yes, ma'am." She listened to her praise of Lucy with only moving from one chair to another, and when Mrs. Jennings talked of Edward's affection, it only cost her a spasm in her throat. Such advances towards heroism in her sister made Elinor feel equal to anything herself. The next morning brought excuse me. The next morning brought a farther trial of it in a visit from their brother, who came with a most serious aspect to talk over the dreadful affair and to bring them the news of his wife. "You've heard, I suppose," he said with great solemnity as he was seated, "of the very shocking discovery that took place under our roof yesterday." They all looked their assent. It seemed too awful a moment for speech. "Your sister," he concluded, "has suffered dreadfully. Mrs. Ferrars, too, in short, has been a scene of such complicated distress, but I hope that the storm may be weathered without our being any of us quite overcome. Poor Fanny, she was all in hysterics yesterday, but I would not alarm you too much. Donovan says there's nothing materially to be apprehended. Her constitution is a good one, and her resolution equal to anything. She has borne it all, with the fortitude of an angel. She says she shall never think well of anybody again, and one can't wonder at it after being so deceived. Meeting with such ingratitude where so much kindness had been shown, so much confidence had been placed, it was quite out of the benevolence of her heart that she had asked these young women to her house, merely because they thought they deserved some attention, were harmless, well-behaved girls, and would be pleasant companions. For otherwise we both wished very much to have invited you and Marianne to be with us, while your kind friend there was attending her daughter. And now to be so rewarded, I wish with all my heart, says poor Fanny in her affectionate way, that we had asked your sisters instead of them." He stopped to be thanked, which being done, he went on. "What poor Mrs. Ferrars suffered when first Fanny broke it to her is not to be described. While she with the truest affection had been planning a most eligible connection for him, it was to be supposed that he could be all the time secretly engaged to another person. Such a suspicion could never have entered her head. If she suspected any prepossession anywhere, it would not be in that quarter. There, to be sure, said she, I might have thought myself safe. She was quite in agony. We consulted together, however, as to what was to be done, and at last she determined to send for Edward. He came, but I'm sorry to relate what ensued. All that Mrs. Ferrars could say to make him put an end to the engagement, all that Mrs. Ferrars could say to make him put an end to the engagement, assisted too, as you may well suppose, by my arguments and Fanny's entreaties, was of no avail. Duty, affection, everything was disregarded. I never thought Edward so stubborn, so unfeeling before. His mother explained to him her liberal designs in case of his marrying Miss Morton. Told him she would settle on him the Norfolk estate, which clear a land tax brings in a good $1,000 a year. Offered even, when matters grew desperate, to make it $1,200. And in opposition to this, if he still persisted in this low connection, represented to him the certain penury that must attend the match. His own £2,000, she protested, should be his all. She would never see him again, and so far would she be from affording him the smallest assistance, that if he were to enter into any profession with a view of better support, she would do all in her power to prevent him advancing in it. Here Marianne, in an ecstasy of indignation, clapped her hands together and cried, "Gracious God, can this be possible?" Well, you may wonder, Marianne, replied her brother, at the obstinacy which could resist such arguments as these. Your exclamation is very natural. Marianne was going to retort, but remembered her promises and forbore. All this, however, he continued, was urged in vain. Edward said very little, but what he did say was in the most determined manner. Nothing should prevail on him to give up his engagement. He would stand to it, cost him what it might. Then, cried Mrs. Jennings with blunt sincerity, no longer able to be silent, he has acted like an honest man. I beg your pardon, Mr. Dashwood, but if he had done otherwise, I should have thought him a rascal. I have some little concern in the business as well as yourself, for Lucy Steele's my cousin, and I believe there's not a better kind of girl in the world, nor one who more deserves a good husband. John Dashwood was greatly astonished, but his nature was calm, not open to provocation, and he never wished to offend anybody, especially anybody of good fortune. He therefore replied without any resentment, I would by no means speak disrespectfully of any relation of yours, madam. Miss Lucy Steele is, I dare say, a very deserving young woman, but the present case, you know, the connection must be impossible, and to have entered into a secret engagement with a young man under her uncle's care, the son of a woman, especially of such very large fortune as Mrs. Ferrars, is perhaps altogether a little extraordinary. In short, I don't mean to reflect upon the behavior of any person whom you have a regard for, Mrs. Jennings. We all wish her extremely happy, and Mrs. Ferrars' conduct throughout the whole thing has been such as every conscientious good mother in like circumstances would adopt. It's been dignified and liberal. Edward has drawn out his own lot, and I fear it'll be a bad one. Marianne sighed out her similar apprehension, and Elinor's heart wrung for the feelings of Edward, while braving his mother's threats, for a woman could not reward him. Well, sir, said Mrs. Jennings, and how did it end? Well, I'm sorry to say, ma'am, in a most unhappy rupture. Edward's dismissed forever from his mother's notice. He left her house yesterday, but where he's gone or whether he's still in town, I don't know, for we, of course, can make no inquiry. Poor young man, what's to become of him? Well, what indeed, madam? It's a melancholy consideration, born of the prospect of such affluence. I can't conceive a situation more deplorable. The interest of £2,000, how can a man live on it? And when to that is added the recollection that he might, but for his own folly, within 3 months have been in the receipt of £2,500 a year, for Miss Morton has £30,000, I can't picture to myself a more wretched condition. We must all feel for him, the more so because it's totally out of our power to assist him. Poor young man, cried Mrs. Jennings. I'm sure he should be very welcome to bed and board at my house, and so I'd tell him if I could see him. It's not fit that he should be living about at his own charge now at lodgings and taverns. Elinor's heart thanked her for such kindness towards Edward, though she could not forbear smiling at the form of it. If he would only have done as well by himself, said John Dashwood, as all his friends were disposed to do by him, he might now have been in his proper situation, and would have wanted for nothing. But as it is, it must be out of anybody's power to assist him. And there's one thing more preparing against him, which must be worse than all. His mother has determined, with a very natural kind of spirit, to settle that estate upon Robert immediately, which might have been Edward's on proper conditions. I left her this morning with her lawyer, talking over the business. Well, said Mrs. Jennings, that's her revenge. Everybody has a way of their own. But I don't think mine would be to make one son independent because another's plagued me. Marianne got up and walked about the room. Can anybody be more galling to the spirit of a man, continued John, than to see his younger brother in possession of an estate which might have been his own? Poor Edward, I feel for him sincerely. A few minutes more spent in the same kind of effusion concluded his visit, and with repeated assurances to her sisters and with repeated assurances to his sisters that he really believed that there was no material danger in Fanny's indisposition, and that they need not therefore be very uneasy about it, he went away, leaving the three ladies unanimous in their sentiments on the present occasion, as far at least as it regarded Mrs. Ferris's conduct, the Dashwoods, and Edwardses. Marianne's Marianne's indignation burst forth as soon as he quitted the room, and as her vehemence made reserve impossible for Elinor and unnecessary in Mrs. Jennings, they all joined in a very spirited critique upon the party. That was chapter 37. All right, we got 12. That's 38, 13. 13 more. 12 more. Anyway. Yeah. So thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe if you're not. Like the video. If you are want an ad-free experience, you can check out my Patreon in the I don't know, the description. But everything that I record, I'll always put up on YouTube. YouTube always runs the ads, but if you deal with that or you got YouTube Red, you're fine. So yeah, thank you for watching. Make sure you tell a friend if you're having fun. Get some more folks in here. And thank you very much for watching, and have a great evening. And I'll talk to you next time.